So far we had been looking at paging, and let's review it once again. We said that segmentation allows you mapping from virtual address to physical address, but it only allows contiguous mappings because it's a simple base plus VA gives PA mapping, which is not very flexible. It has problems of fragmentation, and it has problems if a process wants to grow, etc. So if you had a more general mapping, and that's what paging implements, then it would be much more flexible. And what paging does is divides the physical address space and the virtual address space into page aligned, fixed size, page sized units, right, which are called pages. So aligned fixed size units, which are called pages, and now there is a mapping hardware in the middle which will map a page in virtual address space to a page in physical address space. This mapping hardware is basically requires a table which can have at most 2 to the power 20 entries. So such a large table cannot be stored on chip. So such a table needs to be stored on physical memory, right? Or the technology for physical memory is also called DRAM. So you store the table in physical memory. Also we said that rather than storing the table contiguously, which will make it very large, 4 megabytes, let's divide it into a 2-level hierarchy, and so that way small processes will only have very small page tables, and large processes will also benefit in space. Even if there are all the pages mapped, even then the 2-level hierarchy is not too much space hungrier than 1-level page hierarchy. All right. Okay. So on the chip there is a register called CR3 which holds a physical address which points to the base of the page directory. The virtual address is used, the 10 bit top 10 bits of the virtual address are used to index into the page directory, from which you get a 20-bit physical address of the page table and 12 bits of flags. These flags are 3 relevant flags for us are present, user and writable. So whether the page is present, whether page table is present in this case, whether a user mode execution can access it, and whether it's writable, right. So for example, if this is non-writable, then all the pages which are referenced from here, they are all non-writable, right. On the other hand, if this is writable, then depending on what the flags are for the in the page table, corresponding page table entry, the page will have writable or read-only permissions. Right. So the top 10 bits are used to index the page directory. The next 10 bits are used to index the page table, and the last 12 bits are used as an offset into the page. Right. Okay. All right. And we said that an operating system can implement multiple processes or multiple address spaces by switching the page table on every context switch, right. So each time the operating system wants to change from P1 to P2, you change the CR3 value from P1's page directory to P2's page directory, right. You just load a new value into CR3 and you have a new page table. And we also said that the kernel maps itself into the address space at the same point in every page table. So a process does not see the entire 4 gigabytes of virtual address space, it sees something less than that. On XV6 it only sees the bottom 2 gigabytes, and the top 2 gigabytes of the virtual address space are reserved for the operating system or the kernel. Okay. And so the kernel is really mapped at the same place, pointing to the same physical addresses in every process, right. And so we also said that hence every user process is also a kernel thread, right, because a process now has 2 halves. One is the user half, which the user can access, and the other is the kernel half, which only the kernel can access. A user cannot just switch into the kernel half. The only way a user can switch into the kernel half is through the interrupt descriptor table, through a trap, right. And once it switches into the kernel half, then it executes in kernel mode. It's possible that multiple processes simultaneously are executing in the kernel half, in which that's why we are calling them kernel threads. Okay. On the other hand, if multiple processes are executing concurrently on the user half, no problem, because these are independent address spaces. All right. Okay. So how many accesses, physical memory accesses, does the processor need to make on a memory access by the program? 3. So first you will dereference, first you will add these 10 bits to CR3 and then dereference this value. So that's memory access number 1. then you will get these bits and dereference this value, that's memory access number 2. Then you will get this and then dereference this value, that's 3, right. So for every memory access you're actually making 3 physical memory accesses. So for every virtual memory access you're making 3 physical memory accesses, and that's not acceptable, right, that's too costly. In segmentation we saw that such a problem was solved by basically ensuring that when a segment descriptor gets loaded, the segment descriptor gets cached into the chip, right. So you don't need to access memory to get the base value each time, base value is just cached on chip. Similarly in paging also there is caching involved, and there is a special cache called the translation look aside buffer. Translation look aside buffer, or TLB for short. Okay. This caches VPN virtual page number to PPN mappings. Okay. So each time you basically access a page, a virtual address, you walk the page table, the two level page table, and you get a physical address, right. But there was a mapping from the virtual page number to the physical page number that this page table structure was providing. So if you could cache this end-to-end mapping from VPN to PPN in your TLB, then and you could first check your TLB, and so TLB is on chip, right, this is on chip on CPU. So if the virtual address, the VPN corresponding to the virtual address being accessed is already in the TLB, you don't need to walk the page table, you can just get the PPN from there, add the offset and directly access the memory. So that way you just have to have, if you get a TLB hit, implies 1 access per VA access, right? 1 physical memory access per VA access. A miss implies 3, right. So if there is a TLB miss, you have to walk the page table just like before. If the TLB hit, you don't need to go to the physical memory, right. So it's important in real world that most of your memory accesses are TLB hits. You know, most of your virtual address accesses are TLB hits for to have any acceptable performance, right. Otherwise, you know, the whole idea of paging falls flat if the TLB hit ratio was not high enough, right, because segmentation was giving me a very fast translation. If paging is giving me a 2x overhead on every memory access, that's not acceptable, right. So fortunately most programs have a very high locality of access, especially because we are dividing the address space into page level granularity. One entry, one VPN to PPN entry is capturing locality of access within an entire page, right. And so it's possible to have a small TLB and yet have hit rates of 99.9% or above, right, and that's the kind of hit rate you will want in such a system to have any acceptability of this paging idea, right. So you know, typical TLB sizes on modern processors will be, let's say, 4 kilobytes also, right, roughly. So you know, a 4 kilobyte TLB can cache, let's say each TLB entry requires 8 bytes, then a 4 kilobyte entry will a 4 kilobyte TLB can cache 512 such page entries, and assuming that your memory footprint, so you can basically cache 512 VPN to PPN mappings in your TLB, and assuming that the program's memory footprint is less than 512 pages, then pretty much you should be able to access, you know, this translation should be pretty much free. You're only accessing the on-chip TLB, okay. All right. Also, let's understand, whenever we talk about caching, So assume you have seen caching and you know what is hit ratio and all that, right? So I've been talking about hit ratio, and let's say this is greater than 99 point, let's say just a ballpark figure, 99 to 100% somewhere in the middle. And that's the kind of hit ratios we are looking at. Okay, so when we talk about caching, we should also say what is its cache replacement policy, what is its associativity, what is whether it's a write through or a write back cache, right? So you have seen all these terms in your computer architecture class, right? Okay, so firstly, what is its associativity, which means you know about cache associativity. So typically the TLB is a fully associative cache, right? You want your TLB to have such a high hit rate, so you better make it fully associative. If on the other hand you had a direct mapped cache, you will just have conflict misses in your cache, right? Okay. The other thing is, what's the cache replacement policy? Well, the hardware is free to implement any cache replacement policy it likes. Given that most of the things are going to be hits, cache replacement policy does not. Cache replacement policy usually matters if the size of your caches are small. If your size of the caches are bigger than the working set size, then cache replacement policy is actually not that crucial. It doesn't really matter what your cache replacement policy is. So you can use something like LRU, which will require some bookkeeping, or simpler policy maybe FIFO, and the hardware designer can make a choice. FIFO is simpler to implement, but it may have a slightly lower hit ratio than LRU. LRU is more complex to implement. It may or may not have better hit ratios than LRU and all that. Now let's look at whether it's a write back or a write through cache. Let's see what happens. Each time a page table is walked by the hardware, the entry gets cached into the TLB. So this is a read operation, right? All these lookups are just reads of the page table. The only write to the page table is when the kernel actually overwrites some entry by looking at that particular address, right? Recall that the page table itself is mapped in the kernel address space, right? So the kernel can change the page table by just writing to a memory location there. If the kernel changes a page table entry, TLB does not even come to know about it, right? So a kernel needs to the kernel needs to tell the hardware explicitly to invalidate a page directory entry or TLB entry, right? So there's an instruction called, let's say, invalidate page, and it takes a virtual address, right? Basically means invalidate any entry in the TLB corresponding to this virtual address, right? So explicit invalidation of the TLB entry, the cached entry. If the kernel forgets to do that, it's a bug, right? Very bad things can happen. Okay, you can imagine what can happen. What can happen is that the kernel thinks that it has mapped a certain page somewhere else and removed the entry here, but the TLB still caches that entry, and now a user can probably access somebody else's page, right? So those kind of bad things can happen. So it's important that the kernel executes each time it changes a page table entry, it invalidates the page, all TLB entries corresponding to a particular virtual address, or the single TLB entry corresponding to a virtual address. Also, each time you do a context switch, you change CR3, right? So what should happen to the TLB? The entire address space has changed, right? So you should completely flush the TLB, right? So reload of CR3 implies TLB flush, right? So on every context switch, you flush the TLB completely, because the entire address space has changed. All the VPN to PPN mappings have old cache VPN to PPN mappings need to be invalidated. Okay, all right. So it's important for an operating system to ensure that the number of entries in the TLB typically remains small, and one method that the hardware provides to do that is supporting what are called large pages on x86, right. So let's see, there's something called large pages. Okay. So we said normal pages are 4 kilobytes, but large pages are 4 megabytes. Okay. So you could have large pages, and how does the x86 architecture implement large pages? In the flags of the page directory entry, there's yet another bit. So for PDE flags, there's another bit which says page size. Right. If the page size bit is 0, it means it's a normal page. If the page size bit is 1, it means it's a large page. And if it's a large page, it treats the 20-bit pointer not as a page table, but as a pointer to that 4 MB page. Okay. So if it's a large page, then this pointer is pointing to a 4 MB page directly, right? Because you can imagine that a large page, if you are basically talking about a 4 MB page, you have divided your physical address space into pages of size 4 MB, right? And so pages of size 4 MB means 2 to the power 22 bits are basically used for an offset, right? And the top 10 bits, so 22 bits are used for the offset, and the top 10 bits are used to identify the page number, right? And so the top 10 bits of the virtual address are used to index the page directory entry to get the large page number, right? Even large pages need to be aligned at page granularity, right? So a large page should always start at 4 MB boundaries, right? So there will be a large page at address 0, and then the next large page will be at address 4 MB and 8 MB and so on. Just like small pages were aligned at 4 KB, large pages are aligned at 4 MB. Right? And so 10 bits are enough to name a large page. And so the top 10 bits of the virtual address are enough to name a large page, and so the page directory entry directly points to a 4 MB region. Right? If you're using small pages, then you allow this 4 MB. In any case, the page one entry in the page directory is quite capable of mapping 4 MB of virtual address space. If you're using small pages, this 4 MB can be fragmented in 4 KB chunks across the physical memory. If you're using large pages, then this 4 MB chunk has to be contiguous in physical memory, right? That's the only difference. So what's the advantage of doing this? The first advantage is the time it takes to actually walk the page table has reduced. You only need to dereference one, or make 2 accesses for one, even if there's a TLB miss. More importantly, the number of entries that need to be cached in the TLB has reduced, right? As opposed to 2 to the power 10 entries for a 4 megabyte space, you need only 1 entry if you can ensure that the entire space is contiguous. But it also means that the program should, the operating system should take care of things like fragmentation, right? For example, small processes should not be given large pages. Large processes can be given large pages, but make sure that they are actually using those large pages because in the entire address space. If they are not, then I'm basically worrying about fragmentation and all that kind of issues. One big place where large pages are really useful is to map the kernel itself, right? So we said that every process, let's say this is P1, maps the kernel starting at 2 GB, let's say, right? And we said this mapping of the kernel is basically a one-to-one mapping to the physical address space. This is the physical address space, and this is going from 0 to M, then this is going to from 2 GB to 2 GB plus M, right? So it's a completely contiguous mapping in the kernel, right? That's what we saw, that the kernel just maps the entire physical memory into its address space, at least in x86, and we said other operating systems can recycle virtual address space for if the amount of physical memory is greater than what can be supported in the address space. So for this kind of a mapping, which is completely contiguous, it doesn't make sense to use small pages. You can just use large pages, right? So you can just have 4 MB pages to store this mapping for the kernel. That way the kernel, the size of there are few advantages of this. Number one, the size of the page table has reduced, right, because you only need few entries to map the kernel, you have made the granularity bigger. So the overhead that we had, so we said that every process needs to map the kernel. So every process has to have this extra overhead of having these extra entries for the kernel address space. If you're using large pages, then this overhead has decreased significantly, number one. Number two, more importantly, the TLB pressure has decreased. The number of entries that need to be in the TLB to cache this mapping has decreased, and so you can have better height ratios in your TLB. Right? So large pages can be used other places, but one place where they have a direct use, immediate use in the operating system designs that we are talking about is that you just use these large pages to map the kernel itself. Okay?
While caching a page, do we need to actually store 4 MB in the cache? It's very large value.
While caching a page, no, you mean in the TLB?
Yes.
So in the TLB you only store one mapping, right?
Yeah.
VPN to PPN. If you're using 4 kilobyte pages, you could potentially have 2 to the power 10 entries to map an entire 4 MB space, right? On the other hand, if you're having large pages, then you'll have only one entry for that entire space. But large pages have problems of fragmentation and wastage of space potentially if you are not careful, and yeah, so yeah, there's a trade-off. But here's one case where it's a no-brainer to always use large pages. Yes, question.
So since that space is going to be constant, so why not directly map it? Why use any sort of paging mechanism?
Okay, so question is why use any sort of paging mechanism to map this space? You know, it will be great if the hardware could provide me a mechanism saying, oh, map the entire space here. But the hardware doesn't do that, right? I mean, once you have enabled paging, you have to go through the page table, right? And you know, one way the hardware designer could have said was, you know, have another bit saying that this is not going to go through paging. This particular address is not going to go through paging. You know, it makes the hardware even more complex. So, you know, one way to do that is just use the existing page table hardware. And large pages can be used both for the kernel and for other things also. Okay, so the hardware designer does not necessarily want to complicate his hardware just to support the kernel space mapping, when he can achieve the same effect by using a more general mechanism of using large pages. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. So with that, let's continue our discussion of from yesterday, where we are looking at how does the OS boots. Let's look at the OS boot up. And we said, let's say here's a disk, and here are its blocks. Block 0, 1, 2, and so on. And we said this particular block or sector is special, right? So each of these sectors is 512 bytes. And sector number 0 is special, it's called the boot sector. And the contract with the hardware is that it will load this boot sector at a particular memory location. It will copy this boot sector in the particular memory location. So let's say this is the physical address. Going from 0 to some value, let's say M. So it's going to copy these 512 bytes at some location, the boot sector BS, and the address it loads it as 7C00, right? I mean, these addresses are just historical in nature. You know, this must have been the address at which it had loaded, you know, back in the 1980s, and it still continues because for backward compatibility, we want that the operating system that was written in 1981 should still run, right? So for that reason, it has to do the same thing. Okay. So and we said that the operating system developer needs to write a boot sector code that should know where the kernel lives in the disk, number one, and it should load the kernel into memory and then jump to the kernel, right? So all that operation needs to be coded up in the boot sector, and all this the code to do all this should fit inside 512 bytes, right? That's a constraint, and that's relatively easy to meet. It's not a big deal, and we are going to look at the boot sector code of XV6. Okay. So please take out your this thing, code listings. Okay, so firstly we are looking at code of x86, right? This code will get compiled using let's say a compiler like GCC, and we have discussed this before, and then the code will get linked, right? And then you will get an executable. That executable is what we call the kernel. You know, the x86 links into what's called an executable file, which is called the kernel, right? And that kernel will also, and there will be another sort of file which will be the boot sector code, right? So, and the linker will set up the addresses and set up things in such a way that the boot sector code will live in the first sector of the disk, number one, and number two, the boot sector code knows that it will start at a certain address called 7C00, right? That's the hardware specification. So let's assume that the boot sector, so the boot sector code actually starts at this point, right? 8412. So this is the assembly code of the boot sector, all right? And the line 8409 is saying code 16, which basically means treat this code as a 16-bit code, right? So this is a 16-bit code. The next line says global start, which basically means consider this symbol start as a global symbol. Okay, what it means we can talk about it later. So this is the first instruction that gets executed on when the computer gets booted up in x86. The first instruction in this case is CLI. CLI is basically just disabling interrupts, right? So what does the CLI instruction do? Recall that the x86 architecture has this register called eFlags, and one of the bits in the eFlags is whether interrupts are enabled or disabled. If interrupts are enabled, then an external device is allowed to assert the interrupt pin, and my execution will switch to the handler immediately. If interrupts are disabled, even if the external device asserts the interrupt pin, I will not switch to the handler, right? Okay, so so first recall that the x86 has a register called eFlags. One of the bits in the eFlags is what's called the interrupt flag or interrupt enable flag, or IF. Okay. The semantics are, if IF is equal to 0 implies will not receive any external interrupts. In other words, just ignore the external interrupt. Okay, and if it's 1, then it's the usual thing, you know, take a trap on an external interrupt. Okay. So if IF is equal to 0, you just ignore the external interrupt. If I is equal to 1, then you will take a trap on the external interrupt, and recall that the trap goes through the interrupt descriptor table to call the handler. Why the first instruction is clearing the interrupt? Because I have not set up any handlers yet, right? The BIOS may have had set up its own handlers. So there's some, you know, BIOS that has run before the first instruction has run. It may have set up its own handlers, and now I want to completely forget what the BIOS has done to the system. I want to now, you know, reinitialize the system according to myself, and while I'm doing that, I don't want any disturbance from outside world, right? So if an outside if there's a network packet coming or anything of that sort, or disk wants some attention, just ignore all that. I'm not in the state to actually serve all these people. So let's clear the interrupts, right? So that's what, so CLI basically sets IF to 0, okay. Okay, then the next thing you do is you say XOR AX. The effect of XORing a register with itself is that you just zero out the register, okay. And then you move AX to all the segment registers, DS, ES, SS. Why am I doing this? To have a flat address space, right? I don't want to have a segmented address space. Let's set up my segment register. Recall that in 16-bit mode, the segment register, the segmentation works by simply multiplying the segment register value by 16 and adding it to the virtual address to get a physical address. So I don't want any segmentation, so I just set it to 0, so my virtual address is equal to physical address from now on, okay. So from now on my virtual address is equal to physical address.
Sir?
Yes.
So like instead of XORing, could we have directly moved $0 into it?
Yes, could you have directly moved $0 into AX? Yes, you could have. Why is he doing it in this way? It turns out it's more efficient to do it. And this is, this is a standard thing that assembly programmers use, that instead of moving 0 to AX, just XOR it with itself. That turns out to be more efficient, counterintuitively, right? Anyways, I mean, you could have done the other thing also.
So then we could have XORed all three of them with themselves.
Okay, so no, but see, DS, ES, SS are special registers. They cannot only, a certain instruction move can be used on them. You cannot use arithmetic instructions on segment registers. You can only use arithmetic instructions on general purpose registers, which are EX, ABCD, ESP, EBP, ESI, EDI, right? So you can only use arithmetic, and you can't even move an immediate value to the segment register directly. You can only move it through a general purpose register. So these are just constraints of the architecture, right? So that's why he's doing it like this. All right. Then there is some code to allow addresses above 20 bits. So the original 8086 machines didn't allow addresses which are greater than 20 bits, right? At that time the machine was 16-bit, but now we want a 32-bit architecture. So there is some code to allow addresses above 20 bits. In any case, we can ignore this, all right? So let's ignore this. It's needed for your program to run, but it's not needed for us to understand what's going on, all right? So let's just ignore this, and let's instead come to this instruction. LGDT GDDesc. What am I doing? I want to load a global descriptor table, and notice that this LGDT instruction is actually a 32-bit instruction, right? It's not a 16-bit instruction, because in 16-bit there was no GDT. In 16-bit segmentation was just multiply the segment selector by something and that's it. The GDT is only in the protected mode, and so what I'm going to do in the next 4 lines is basically switch to 32-bit mode, right? But before I switch to 32-bit mode, I need to set up my GDT and all these things, so that when I switch to it, it knows exactly where am I standing and all that, right? Okay. So what are the semantics of LGDT GDDesc? GDDesc itself, the descriptor, is defined here at line 8487. Okay, and it contains the location of the GDT, and it contains the size of the GDT, right? Recall that we said that the GDT is specified by a size and a base also, right? So this is the base of the GDT, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and this is the maximum size of the GDT. So that's what you specify in the GDDesc, and let's look at where GDT is. That's at this line 8482, right? Which contains your segment descriptors, right? So segment descriptors are nothing but numbers, right? They are just numbers which basically specify this flag should be set up, this is the base, this is the limit, and all that kind of stuff, right? So in this case, here is a number called seg null ASM, which basically says 0th descriptor is null, never use it, nobody should ever use it, all right? The second one says it's using a macro. So these are all macros. Seg null ASM is a macro which will get macro expanded. So you can actually browse the x86 code to see exactly what number this seg null ASM represents. But whatever the number is, it basically sets up the GDT 0th entry to say that this should never be accessed, basically, dereference. The second says seg underscore ASM, which is again a macro. STAX which says give execute privileges, X is for execute, STAR is saying give read privileges. So these are basically specifying what flags I want in the GDT descriptor. 0 says what's the base of the GDT descriptor, and this FFFF says what's the limit of the GDT descriptor, right? So you use a macro to say construct the GDT descriptor with flags execute and readable, and base 0 and limit 2 to the power 32 minus 1. Okay. So the intent is that the descriptor number 1 is going to be dereferenced for all your code, right? So you're going to load the value 1 into CS, descriptor number 1 into CS, and so code will always go through this, and so that's why it will become executable, right? And all the other ones will have writable, which means writable means it's both readable and writable, and base is 0 and limit is again 2 to the power 32 minus 1, right? So you have a GDT of size 3. The 0th entry is a null entry. The first entry is pointing to an executable segment, which is the entire address space. Then the second entry is pointing to a writable segment, which is again the entire address space. The developer has separated code and data in this way. So he will load code in CS and data in all the other segments, right? You may say, oh, could I have had a single segment which is readable, writable and executable and load that the same thing in everything? That's also perhaps possible, depending on whether x86 allows that kind of thing, that a segment is both writable and executable, right? But in any case, they are they're sharing the entire address space. It's not like CS is living somewhere else and all the other segments are living somewhere else. They're actually living in the same space. The different segment descriptors are only being used to check the type of access, execute versus write. Okay. Clear? All right. Okay. So so you load the GDT, and then you do some things to make sure that you are moving into 32-bit mode. So CR0PE basically says move into protected mode. So the 32-bit mode that we have discussed is also called the protected mode because it offers protection, right? And so then you move this value into CR0. This is a control register 0, which indicates which mode I am running in. When I am running in 16-bit mode, 32-bit mode, or protected mode, etc. And so that's how you move to 32-bit mode.
So why we have taken the limit for both data segment and code segment from 0 to 2 raised to power 32 minus 1?
Why have we taken
The limit from 0 to 2 raised to power 32 minus 1 for both the things, because code and data are two different parts blocks. So limit should be like 0 to, for example, m, and from m to 2 raised to power 32 minus 1.
Okay, so question is why both of them are referring to 0, are pointing to the same region, 0 to 2 to the power 32 minus 1. Why not code referring from 0 to some m and data from m to 2 to the power 32 minus 1? Well, I mean, he could have done that, but that complicates the programming model. Sometimes you want to access code just like data.
But we will not be differentiate over whether we want to execute it or we want to write over it.
Right. So basically, this kind of organization allows you to see a flat address space, right? It doesn't matter which segment you're going through. You'll always VA will be always equal to PA, right? On the other hand, if you do the other thing, then I'll have to worry about whether I'm going through this segment or that segment. And if you have a flat address space, it allows you to change code using directly its address and then execute it. And because all of them are pointing to the same region, you don't have to worry about CS is pointing here and DS is pointing here. So all the segments, CS, DS, etc., they basically see identical things, right? So the program needs to only worry about the offset. It doesn't need to worry about the segment at all in this organization. So it's a flat segmentation model, right? We have discussed this before. Okay, so I have moved into segmentation mode, into 32-bit mode, but there's one more thing that the x86 architecture requires you to do, which is to say that switch. So right now what happened was I changed the control register 0 to say that I want to execute in 32-bit mode, and then I executed this instruction called ljump, right, long jump. We have seen this before. Segment ID and offset, right. Recall what the ljump does, it just loads CS with this value, the value of seg_k code is 1, alright. So this is equal to 1. So it just loads the first descriptor into CS, segment descriptor number 1 into CS. And what is start 32? Start 32 is just here, right. So start 32 is the value or the address of this particular instruction, whatever comes after start 32, right. So it's basically saying jump, so it's by using ljump it's basically causing CS to get overwritten. Right now CS was 0, now you are overwriting CS with 1 shifted by 3 bits, right. So that way you basically are looking at the first segment descriptor and now you are actually executing through the GDT, okay. And start 32 is the address of this. Once again, because everything was 0, so I didn't have to worry about start 32 is an offset, etc. Start 32 is just an address and offset is equal to address, so no problem. Okay. All right. So at this point I have loaded the code segment and I have loaded the EIP and I have moved into 32-bit mode. So the moment I have loaded the new code segment, I basically have declared that I am executing in 32-bit mode, and that's why this particular directive here, code 32, is telling the hardware that telling the assembler that interpret all the next instructions as 32-bit instructions. Okay. And now the first few things that you do is that you load all the segment registers with k data. K data is 2, let's say. So 2. So you load segment number descriptor number 2 into DS, ES, SS, all the other segments, right.
So why are we bit shifting the 3?
Recall that the segment selector, so the segment register had the last 3 bits reserved for something else. The top, the segment selector itself was living only in the last, in the top sort of 13 bits. So that's why we are shifting it by 3, right. Also recall that the last 2 bits of the CS register were meant to indicate the privilege level. In this case, when I am shifting it by 3, the last 2 bits are 0, and so I am still executing in privilege level. Okay. All right. So I load up all the segment registers, just like before, but this time with a different value, seg_k data, which is 2 shifted left by 3. Okay. All right. And then what I do is I move $start to ESP. What am I doing here? Let's see. What is $start? $start was the address of this place, which was 0x7c00, right. We said that that's where the code is going to start, and so the linker has organized it in such a way that the address of this place is 0x7c00. That's why we started at that place, right. So the value of $start is basically 0x7c00 and I am putting it in ESP. What I am really doing is I am initializing my stack, alright. So what happened was, let's say this is my PA space, and let's say this is 0x7c00. All this code that we are looking at is actually living in this area, right. So this is start, and let's say this is somewhere here is start 32, right, and up to 512 bytes. Okay. So all this is living in this area, and what I did right now was I set my ESP register to point to this location. And recall that the ESP grows downwards, so all this area here can be used as a stack now, right. So when I am going to make a function call, the stack frame is going to get pushed somewhere here in the lower area. Okay. So that's what I am doing here. When I say move $start $%ESP, I am putting the value 7c00 into ESP, and then the next thing I do is I make a function call, right. So make a function call to boot main, and so the return address gets stored at 0x7c00, right. Actually 0x7c00 minus 4, that is where the return address will get stored, and ESP will get decremented by 4, right. Okay. Where is boot main living? Where did this boot main come from? Boot main is, so we have had, we have executed the first few instructions in assembly. Programming in assembly is difficult, so let's write the rest of our code in C, right. So we are going to, so the boot sector itself, the rest of the boot sector is living, has been written in C. So boot main is also living in the boot sector somewhere. So somewhere here in this space itself, there is boot main, right. And the linker has appropriately arranged for it to be at that address. And the code for boot main is on the next sheet, sheet 85. Okay, and now we see some C code, and that's more familiar and easier to sort of understand. Okay. So what this function is going to do is it's going to load the kernel from the disk into memory. So 512 bytes is too small, so I want to load the other bytes of the kernel into memory and jump to the first instruction of the kernel. That's what this function is going to do, right. And the compiled code of this function is living in the food sector. All right, and so let's understand first how the kernel is organized. So what happened was you had some .c files and .s files in your xv6, right. You converted them to star.o files, and then you, let's say through GCC, and then you linked all these .o files and got some image which is called the kernel, right. This kernel is an executable file in a format called ELF, right. Even your programs, when your a.out files, etc., they are also in this format called ELF, and this there's a standard format, so it's a specification that this is the format of an executable file. And what the executable file will have is basically it will have things like, so if I look inside kernel, it will say, oh, by the way, this is my file, and this is byte number 0, byte number 1, and so on, and it will say, oh, byte number 0 has to have certain header which will indicate where my code is. So there will be some pointer here which says, here is all your code, right. Here's where it starts and here's where it ends, so all the size and all that, and then it will say, okay, let's say here is all your data in the file, and so on, right. It will also say that this code should be loaded at what address. So it may say load code at address 1 2 3 4 5, right, and load data at address whatever 4 5 6 7 8. Okay. So it has all this information. It says here's your code, here's the data, load code at this address, load data at this address, right. These are virtual addresses, right. I mean this is basically whatever address space I am currently executing in. So if I am executing a program, I look at this ELF file, and the process has some address space, and so ELF file will tell me in this address, so let's say the process has an address space from 0 to 2 GB, the ELF file will say load the code at address 5 MB and load the data at address 7 MB, alright, and that's it, okay. And here is the first instruction. So the other thing it has is start. Where to start? So you've loaded the code and you've loaded the data into the address space, pasted them there, and now you want to know where should I start. So what's the first instruction I should execute? In other words, what should I initialize EIP to, right? And so that's also stored in this file. It basically says after you've loaded it, set EIP to this, and you're good to go. After that, you just execute whatever you like, and you'll probably execute some instructions, you'll make some system calls, whatever you do, right? Similarly, in this case, in the kernel case, it's not really the kernel is not going to be loaded inside a process, but it's going to be loaded by the bootloader into physical address space initially, right? Okay. Also, when you say that the code should be loaded at a certain address, the code internally could have pointers to itself, right? So, for example, inside it I could say jump to some address 12456, right? So 12456 should be meaningful, right? Because I know that I'm going to be loaded at 12345, so I know that what instruction is going to live at 456, and so internally I could say jump to 456, so I know what instruction is going to get executed at that time. So for example, functions are named by addresses, variables are named by addresses, right? So a variable will live in the data section, a global variable will live in the data section, right? A function will live in the code section, and these things will have internally pointers to each other, right? Some instructions will have pointers to some functions, right? Or some instructions will have pointers to some data, but these are all at fixed addresses because the ELF has dictated that this particular data should be loaded at this address, and you have already pre-computed the address of the variable inside the data section and all that. Okay. Right. So similarly, what's going to happen is that this kernel will say that this is my code and this is my data, and it will say load this code at this address and load this data at this address and so on. And what my bootloader is going to do is respect whatever the ELF file is telling him and put it at the right address. And also the ELF file will contain the start address, and based on that it's going to jump to the kernel, right? And so the kernel so the boot sector's job is over. Now it's the kernel which takes over after that. So the boot sector loads the kernel and jumps to its first instruction, and how it does all this is basically dictated by the ELF file. All right, let's stop here, and we are going to discuss more code next time. So highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with XV6 and all that, and we're going to do more of this next semester, next class.